John Ringling owned the circus. Not a circus. The circus. The one they called the greatest show on earth. The one that arrived in your town on a train once a year. The one your father took you to and lifted you up on his shoulders so you could see over the crowd. For a stretch of years in the 1920s, one man owned all of it, and his name was John Ringling. That was 1925, and he was named one of the richest men in the world. 11 years later, on the 2nd of December, 1936, he died in a hospital bed in New York City. And by one accounting, the figure set down by the Florida historian Gene Burnett, the bank account under his name held $311. $311, not 311,000, not 311 million. $311 for the man who had owned the greatest show on earth. A fortune once put at around $50 million come down to 311. And what sets this apart from every other rich man who died broke is the how of it. He did not gamble it away, he did not drink it, or lose it at cards, or hand it to a swindler. John Ringling saw his ruin coming, understood full well what was about to happen, and made a series of decisions so cold and so deliberate that the last of them reached past his own death to cut his family out of almost everything he had. The title of the story promises a lawsuit, and there was one. In truth, there were years of them. When John Ringling died at last, he left his mansion and his art to the state of Florida, and to his own flesh and blood he left almost nothing. $1 to his wife, $5,000 a year to his sister. To his nephews, nothing at all. So carry one question all the way to the end, because the answer is not the one the will seems to promise. If he cut his own family out of the money, then who ended up owning the circus? That question matters more than anything else in the story, and it does not resolve until the very last turn. One word about the record before the story begins, said once so it does not need repeating. John Ringling died more than 80 years ago, a private man who kept private books, and some of the most quoted numbers about his fall trace back to a single source apiece. Where a figure in this account is firm, its source will be named out loud. Where it rests on one man's telling, that will be said in the open, and no number will be invented to fill a gap. The $311 is one of those single source figures recorded by the historian Gene Burnett, never disproven, and never confirmed by a second source. It is offered here as what it is, and no more. If you had asked anyone in America in 1925 who John Ringling was, the answer came back without a pause. He was the circus king, one of 5 brothers who had built the greatest show on the continent, and the last of them still standing at the top of it. They had no idea how little time was left. Neither did he. To understand how a man that rich dies with $311, you have to start with how he got rich in the first place. And it did not begin with a fortune. It began with 5 brothers and a wagon. The Ringlings came from Baraboo, Wisconsin, and in 1884, 5 of the brothers put on their first show. It was small, a few cheap seats, and a handful of animals. In 1889, a grown man could get in for 50 cents and a child for 25. 5 brothers, splitting the whole enterprise 5 ways, about 20% each, working a trade most respectable people looked down on. But they were relentless, and they were disciplined in a way the circus world had never seen. While rival shows drank and brawled and cheated their customers, the Ringlings ran a clean operation and poured every dollar back into the show. Year after year it grew, and then they did the thing that made them immortal. At the turn of the century, the biggest name in the business belonged to someone else. Barnum and Bailey, the greatest show on earth itself, the show that P.T. Barnum had made famous across the world. Its co-owner, James Bailey, died in 1906. And on the 8th of July, 1907, the Ringling brothers bought the whole company from Bailey's widow for $400,000. With that, in the words of the record, the greatest show on earth became the property of the Ringlings. Take the measure of what that meant. The country boys from Wisconsin now owned the most famous circus name on the planet, the one their old rival had spent his life building. For a time, the brothers ran the two as separate shows. Then they folded them together into a single colossus, and by the 1920s, John Ringling had outlived or bought out the others and stood alone at the head of all of it. And he did not stop at the circus. He put his money into railroads, into oil, into land. By 1925, John Ringling was listed among the richest men in the world, a fortune once estimated at around $50 million. He collected art on a scale that embarrassed museums. With his wife Mabel, he had begun building a palace on the water down in Florida. He was in his late 50s, he had beaten everyone, and he had already decided where the last act of his life would be spent. On a quiet, half-empty stretch of the Gulf Coast called Sarasota. That was where he made the decision that began the fall. And it did not look like a mistake. It looked like a coronation. Sarasota, Florida, in the middle of the 1920s, was in the grip of a fever. The Florida land boom was on, the wildest real estate mania the country had ever seen, and fortunes seemed to rise overnight out of swamp and sand. John Ringling did not just join the boom. He tried to own it. He bought islands. Somewhere around 2,000 acres of Longboat Key and the keys scattered around it, which he meant to transform into a millionaire's playground of grand hotels and waterfront estates, a private paradise with his own name across it. But an island is worth nothing if nobody can reach it. So, to connect his holdings to the mainland, John Ringling reached into his own pocket and built a causeway, a bridge across the bay that opened on the 2nd of February, 1926. Out on the island itself, he began raising the centerpiece of the entire vision, a Ritz-Carlton hotel meant to draw the wealthy of the whole country down to his stretch of the Gulf Coast. And for himself and Mabel, on the edge of Sarasota Bay, he built the house. A Venetian palace of a mansion, finished at Christmas of 1925, that cost around $1.5 million. Think about that figure for a moment. $1.5 million in 1920s money for a single private home. Now pay close attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that follows. Every dollar of this, the 2,000 acres, the causeway, the hotel, the palace, came straight out of John Ringling's own pocket. Cash. He was not borrowing against the Circus to build in Florida. He was pouring his liquid fortune, the actual spendable money, into land and steel and concrete along the Gulf Coast. Added up the way it must have looked on paper. $1.5 million for the house, better than $500,000 more sunk into the hotel. A causeway and 2,000 acres of island on top of that. Millions of dollars in ready cash converted, in the space of a year or two, into property that could not be sold and would not earn. And land and concrete do not spend. You cannot meet a payroll with a half-finished hotel, and you cannot pay a tax bill with a beautiful view of the bay. Then the ground shifted under him. In the autumn of 1926, the Florida boom did not slow down. It died. On the 18th of September, a monstrous hurricane came ashore near Miami. It took the lives of somewhere between 370 and more than 500 people, and it did something like $100 million in damage in the money of the day, an almost unimaginable sum for a single storm in 1926. The Great Miami Hurricane is remembered as the storm that broke the back of the land boom, and after it, the fever was over. Buyers vanished. The prices that had doubled and tripled fell straight through the floor. John Ringling was caught at the worst possible moment, holding land nobody wanted, in the middle of projects nobody would finance. His Ritz-Carlton hotel, the very centerpiece of the whole island dream, with something like $650,000 already sunk into it, was halted in November of 1926. The workers walked off, and it never opened its doors, not once. It stood out there on the quay for years, a concrete shell against the sky, a monument to money that was never coming back, and the taxes came due anyway. This is the quiet cruelty of holding land in a bust. The bills do not stop coming. Between 1925 and 1926, the taxes on Ringling's Sarasota holdings quadrupled. 4 times what they had been the year before, charged on property that was now worth a fraction of what he had paid for it. The man was now land rich and cash poor, bleeding money every single month to carry acreage that no longer produced a dime, and could not be sold at any price he was willing to take. If John Ringling had stopped here, this would be a very different story. He was bruised, but he was not broken. The circus still ran, it still printed money every summer, and the circus was his, all of it. It was the one great asset he had never once borrowed against. He was about to borrow against it. By 1929, John Ringling had a problem the outside world could not see. The circus was still magnificent, still the greatest show on earth, still his. But the Florida disaster had drained his cash. The man who had always paid for everything with money in hand no longer had money in hand. And that brings us to the single most important idea in this entire story, the one line to remember if you remember nothing else. The circus was never the fortune. It was the collateral. For John Ringling's whole life, the circus had been the thing that generated the fortune. The engine. The earner. His pride. But in 1929, with his cash locked up in dead Florida land, the circus changed jobs without a sound. It stopped being the asset he owned and started being the asset he could borrow against. And a man who borrows against the one thing he cannot afford to lose is a man walking toward a cliff in the dark. What he borrowed for was this. In 1929, Ringling saw a chance to do the very thing that had made him great, the thing he had done his whole career: swallow his last serious rival. There was a company called the American Circus Corporation, and it was the only competition left that still mattered. It owned 5 separate circuses of its own, controlled by 3 men named Mugivan, Bowers, and Ballard, and together those 5 shows were the last real rivals the Ringling Circus faced anywhere in the country. If John Ringling could buy that one company, he would own, in a single stroke, all but every circus of any consequence in America. No competitor left standing, no rival train pulling into a rival town. Total, absolute command of the American circus from one coast to the other. It was the crowning ambition of his entire life. And then he made the one decision that changed everything. The price was $1,700,000, and John Ringling did not have $1,700,000 in cash because his cash was all sitting out in the Florida sun. So he did the thing he had never done in his life. He went to a lender, a man named William Grieve, president of a firm called New York Investors, and he borrowed the money. As security for the loan, in the words of a 1933 account, he put up 1/2 of all his circus stocks. He pledged half of the greatest show on earth as collateral. And then, as if that were not enough, he guaranteed the note himself, putting his own name and everything behind it on the line. He was not worried, because he had a plan to pay it back, and on paper it was a sound one. He would take the whole combined circus, now the largest on earth, and turn it into a public corporation. The plan was to charter the company and sell shares of it to the investing public, and the money that flooded in from those sales would be more than enough to clear the loan and hand the lender back every cent. It was clever. It was the kind of financial maneuver a man of his stature made almost in his sleep. There was only one thing the entire plan depended on: a healthy, rising stock market to sell those shares into, and he set it all in motion in the autumn of 1929. Anyone who knows what the autumn of 1929 means already feels the floor beginning to give way beneath this story. On the 29th of October, 1929, the stock market collapsed. It was the worst day American finance had ever seen to that point. The opening blow of the Great Depression, and it wiped out fortunes across the country in a matter of hours. And somewhere in that wreckage, easy to lose among the ruined banks and the broken speculators, was John Ringling's entire escape plan. His scheme to refinance the loan by selling circus shares to the public died in a single afternoon. Because who, in the last days of October 1929, was buying shares of anything? There was no market to sell into. There would not be one for years to come. The one thing his whole plan had rested on was gone. So the debt just sat there. Half his circus pledged, his own name on the guarantee, and no way to pay it off. He was $1,700,000 in the hole to a lender who now held a claim on half of everything. And the clock on that loan kept ticking whether the market recovered or not. Stop for a moment and put yourself in his chair. You are in your 60s, you have beaten every rival you ever faced, and you are watching the one asset you swore you would never risk slide toward a stranger's hands, inch by inch, because of a signature you gave to buy a rival you did not even need. What do? The honest answer is that there was very little he could do, and then his own body took the decision out of his hands. By February of 1932, the situation had gone from dangerous to fatal. John Ringling suffered what the Florida Supreme Court would later describe, in its own words, as an acute attack of thrombosis, from which he never recovered. A blood clot. It left him weakened at the very moment he needed to fight for his life's work. And while he lay diminished, the men he owed moved on the thing he had pledged. Missing one interest payment was all it took. A payment of around $18,000, pocket change against a $1.7 million debt, and next to nothing against the $50 million fortune that had once been his, was missed. And that single miss handed the lender the opening he had been waiting for. $18,000. Weigh that against the $50 million he had been worth just a few years earlier. That was the size of the crack that brought the whole thing down. In 1932, control of the circus was taken out of John Ringling's hands. The company was reorganized as a stock corporation, 1,000 shares in all. The creditors who now had their hooks in the loan ended up holding 100 of those shares between two investment firms. John Ringling himself was left with 300. But the decisive block, 600 shares, 60% of the whole company, sat in the hands of two women. They were widows within his own family. Edith Conway Ringling, his brother Charles's widow, and Aubrey Black Ringling, the widow of his nephew Richard. The two women had folded their holdings together into a single family trust, and that trust controlled 600 of the 1,000 shares, 60%, a clear and unshakable majority. John Ringling, the surviving founder, the man who had made every one of them wealthy to begin with, could now be outvoted at any moment by his own family's widows. And that is what happened. When it came to a vote on who would run the greatest show on earth, the two widows voted against John. A man named Sam Gumpertz, a showman brought in from outside the family, was installed to run the circus day to day. John Ringling, the last of the founding brothers, the man whose name was painted on the side of every railroad car, was pushed out of control of his own show. He kept the title, he lost the command. For the last 4 years of his life, John Ringling was a defeated man. Sick, stripped of much of his power, tangled in lawsuits on every side, forced to watch the empire that carried his name run day to day by other people. And the losses were not only financial. His first wife, Mabel, the woman he had built the palace on the bay for, had died in 1929. The year the world began to turn. He married a second time, into a union that curdled fast, and that marriage soured into a bitter divorce, one granted only months before he died, and one his former wife would fight, after his death, to overturn. His health was going, the money was gone. Whatever power he had left had been voted away. Everything John Ringling touched in those final years seemed to come apart in his hands the moment he closed them around it. But he was still John Ringling, and he had one move left. If he could not keep his fortune, he could at least decide who would never get their hands on it. And so, weakened and cornered, he sat down and did the coldest, most deliberate thing in this entire story. He wrote his will. The will was dated the 19th of May, 1934, with a codicil and amendment added on the 2nd of November, 1935. And what it said was extraordinary, which, looking back, was either the coldest act of spite in the history of the family or the shrewdest piece of estate planning any ruined man ever managed. To the state of Florida, he wrote, I give, devise, and bequeath my art museum and residence at Sarasota, the mansion on the bay, the one he had named Ca d'Azan, the art museum beside it, and the enormous collection of paintings inside, worth a fortune all its own, and an endowment of $1.2 million to keep the whole thing running. He gave it all, the house, the museum, the art, to the state government of Florida. Why would a man do that? The state of Florida itself has given the answer in plain language. He did it to protect his art collection from annihilation by his creditors. He handed his greatest possessions to the government on purpose, because a thing owned by the state of Florida is a thing his creditors could never seize, never auction, never break apart to satisfy a debt. Think about the mind that arrives at that solution. A lifetime of buying, of winning, of owning things outright, and at the very end, the shrewdest move left to him is to stop owning, to give the treasure away to the one owner in all of America too large for any creditor to sue, and too permanent for any court to strip. He could not save the fortune for himself. So he put the crown jewels somewhere the debt collectors could never follow, and he signed away the deed to be certain of it. And he attached conditions that tell you how much thought he had put into it. The museum had to open to the public, free of charge, one day every week. The name could never be changed, and not a single work of art could ever be sold or traded away. He was not just giving it to Florida, he was freezing it, free and forever, just as it stood. For his own family, the very same will was a door slammed shut. To his wife, the woman he was in the middle of divorcing, he left this. The sum of $1, and no more. $1. To his sister Ida, he left $5,000 a year for the rest of her life, and not a cent beyond it. And to his nephews, the next generation, the young men who carried his blood and might have expected to inherit an empire, he left nothing at all. Consider the deliberate care in those numbers. Not a modest inheritance, not a token, but $1 to the wife, drawn up in precise legal language so there could be no mistaking it for an oversight. A man does not leave his wife a single dollar by accident. He does it so that she, and everyone reading the will after him, understands past all doubt that it was meant. Then, on the 2nd of December, 1936, of pneumonia, in a New York City hospital bed, John Ringling died, and the accounting of what remained in his name came to that small, famous, terrible figure. A man once counted among the richest in the world, a fortune once estimated at $50 million, and at the very end, by the historian Jean Burnett's telling, $311 in the bank. Set those two numbers side by side, and the fall is hard to believe. $50 million come all the way down to $311. A single dollar left for his wife. $5,000 a year for his sister. Nothing at all for the nephews, and the house, the museum, and the art all locked away inside the government of the state of Florida, where no creditor could ever reach them. Which brings us to the lawsuit the title promised. Except it was not one lawsuit. It was a decade of them. The body was not yet cold. On the 22nd of December, 1936, 20 days after he died, his former wife Emily, the divorce had become final only that summer, went back to court to overturn it and claim instead as his widow, her suit aimed straight at the heirs, the executors, and the trustees of the estate. She was not going to take a single dollar in silence. And there was another strand woven into the same web. 4 days before their wedding, back in 1930, that same woman had lent her husband-to-be $50,000, taking his note and a mortgage on 5 of his paintings as her security. By the time the estate was being fought over, that mortgage had been foreclosed and the note paid, one more claim among the many closing in on $311. And the state of Florida, the beneficiary of the whole design, had to fight for years to take hold of what Ringling had willed it. The case climbed the courts, on appeal in 1938, and again in 1939, and again in 1940, all the way up to the Florida Supreme Court, the case recorded in the law books to this day as North against Ringling. The estate sat tangled in probate for a full 10 years. It was not until 1946 that Florida prevailed and took the museum for good, opening the mansion to the public in December of that year. 10 years of lawyers and appeals to settle the affairs of a man who had died with $311 to his name. But the version of this story that ends with a disinherited family and a decade of lawsuits is not the full picture. Because somewhere in the fine print of that exacting will, John Ringling made one mistake. And that single mistake handed the whole circus to the one man he had tried hardest to cut out. Remember the nephews, the ones the will left with nothing? One of them was named John Ringling North. His uncle had written him out of the money, every last cent, not a dollar. But there was one thing the codicil did not do. When John Ringling rewrote his will to disinherit the family, whether by oversight or design, he left one thing in place that he never struck out. He left his nephew, John Ringling North, named as an executor of the estate. Consider what that means. The will cut North out of the inheritance, but it left him, all the same, holding the legal keys to the estate itself. And John Ringling North understood full well what he had in his hands. Then came the turn that closes the whole loop. Remember those 100 shares of Circus stock? The ones the creditors had wrapped their hands around back in the collapse? The shares pried loose over a missed payment of $18,000. In 1937, the estate bought them back, all 100 of them, for a reported $28,000. Weigh that figure against everything that came before. The controlling shares that had been used to strip John Ringling of his life's work, the very lever that broke him, were bought back into the family for $28,000 in the same small order as the missed payment that had started the whole avalanche in the first place. And of those 100 reclaimed shares, 70 of them went to one man, John Ringling North. The nephew who had been left nothing at all in the will now held the single largest block of the company his uncle had built, and he was not finished. Using his position as executor and building on that block of stock, John Ringling North maneuvered for years, and in 1946 he bought his way to full control of the circus, taking a controlling share of the whole company. The man his uncle had struck out of the will, the nephew left with not $1 of the money, ended up sitting in the owner's chair of the greatest show on earth. The disinheritance failed at the one thing it most wanted to do. John Ringling had built a fortress around his house and his art to keep the debt collectors and the family alike from ever touching them. The one door left unlocked was the one that led back to the circus itself. So who came out ahead? Not John Ringling. He died with $311, his command taken from him years before the end. His wife did not win, left with a single dollar and a lawsuit. The creditors did not win either. They spent years in court and were bought out for $28,000 in the end. And John Ringling North, who seized the circus, won only the right to spend decades fighting over a company that would in time slip out of the family's hands for good. The winner was the state of Florida. And this is the part worth carrying home, because it is the whole lesson of the man's life turned inside out. Everything John Ringling tried to keep for himself, the cash, the land, the circus, the fortune, once valued at $50 million, was taken from him, borrowed away, voted away, or spent into the sand. The only things that survived whole, undivided, protected, were the things he gave away. The house on the bay and the art inside it, handed to the government for the express purpose that no creditor, no court, and no grasping heir could ever break them apart. Go to Sarasota today and you can walk through them. The mansion he called Ca d'Azan, the museum, the paintings he swore could never be sold. All of it still standing, still open to the public, still carrying the name that was never allowed to change. A man who died with, by that one account, $311 to his name, managed to make the one thing he could not be robbed of permanent. And he did it by refusing to leave it to a single person he loved. The circus was never the fortune. It was the collateral. And in the end, the only inheritance John Ringling ever protected was the one he made certain his own family would never touch.